Hi, let's talk about the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is a very interesting little school that existed at the beginning of the 20th century. I'd like to share it with you. All right, so let's show you some slides and talk about it. So the Bauhaus existed from 1919 to 1933, and it's a period of time that is kind of in between wars, right? We had World War One, and then just before the beginning of World War Two was a little window of time where things like the Bauhaus could exist. It started in Germany, in Weimar, Germany, by Walter Gropius. And Bauhaus literally means building house. Walter Gropius, the designer architect, is the founder of that school. So here's the building. Kind of a cool, interesting old building. To us, it looks like an ordinary school, right? But you have to think about the context of when this place existed. It wasn't very common to see text on the side of a building, especially uh, sans serif kind of rounded fonts. That's something we'll talk about in a minute. But also just the square, you know, glass, metal, square, solid walls. That kind of a building was very unique compared to its time period. And it sprung from many of the design principles that the Bauhaus proposed. So, to their way of thinking, there's no separation between the artist and the craftsman. Artist is the exalted craftsman. So, art is a craft. Form follows function. So, if you've ever heard that terminology, whether the form of an object should uh, take precedent over the function or vice versa, they definitely wanted to see a marriage between the two. Um, I don't know if I'm going to attempt to pronounce this word. Gestaltungswerk, complete work of art or synthesis of all forms of art working together. I think one of their goals was for all aspects of the craft, from drawing to design to painting to architecture, could all come together and coexist and be harmonized. True materials, in other words, to celebrate the materials that are used in the design, especially in architecture. So if you have a piece of wood, show it. If you have some metal, let it be visible, right? Minimalism, okay, so no ornamentation, just to decorate. Then also an emphasis on new technology and other types of things like that. So this design principle, these ideas percolated in this school at that time for that brief period of time. Unfortunately, the school, didn't last very long thanks to a little thing called the Nazis. And what's surprising, though, is despite the fact that their ideas were rejected by the political parties at that time, and everything kind of led into World War II, afterward, many of those ideas spread across the world and became kind of the foundation to modern design. So let's look at how they viewed art, right? Art was abstract, shape, line, color, kind of disorganized in a way. But in its disorganization, they're trying to organize ideas and project something that's an absolute 180 degrees from the refined portrait artwork that you had seen in that time period. Design, as in graphic design, look at the way they conceived a poster design. Again, broken down into geometric shapes, emphasizing solid colors, working on a format that is minimal. So there's not a lot of extraneous detail, but it's focusing on that message, the text. They all had their equal weight and importance. Typography as well, simplified. Okay, so we're not trying to do calligraphy or any kind of decorated typography. Instead, we're trying to simplify these shapes down to their essence, to get those letter forms down to the basic geometry so that you can read that letter and recognize it very easily. So it becomes very, very functional. But also at the same time, to make it smooth and rounded and to make those shapes coincide with one another. So you can see how a lot of the letters share the same exact building block shape, that circle, but then it gets adapted to the other letters. So this is a unique way of looking at typography as opposed to the old way, which was kind of derivatives of handcrafted calligraphy. Instead, now it's geometric. It's almost mechanical. Industrial design. So that's where we design objects and their function and their form are supposed to coexist together, which means they have to be simplified. Think Apple, right? That this philosophy has totally inspired Johnny Ives, the product designer at Apple, or former product designer at Apple, simplifying things down to their essence so that they could be useful, but also beautiful. Architecture, again, that idea of exposing things like support beams or stairways is a very unique idea. In the past, those types of things would be hidden, but now they're going to be elevated as a part of the structure of the building is going to be elevated as an important part of that design. So the engineering that went into the building is going to be visible. So it's not hidden, it's visible. Now, to our eyes, we may look at this and go, gosh, that kind of looks really ugly. Maybe we think it that way. Otherwise, as a contrast to a different style of architecture, we might think of it as more modern or unique. Um, it's hard to say. Our eyes, our modern eyes, we've seen it all. So we may or may not resonate. This is what the Bauhaus was a reaction to. Victorian. Victorian was a very ornamented design style. Everything had a flourish and was very organic, right? So if you look at the architecture or the interior design at that era, there were prints and patterns and floral designs and all kinds of ornament. Look at the wood staircase or the way those things were made. Yes, it's beautiful, but it's almost too much. Here's kind of the typography at that time, right? Where you're illustrating the text and surrounding it with shape and borders and patterns. Very different from that simple Bauhaus idea. Art Nouveau is also another design style that was out there, or art style that was just before the Bauhaus, where everything was very organic and things molded and moved and kind of grew through the space. Of course, one of my favorite artists, Alphonse Mucha, was very proficient at this Art Nouveau movement, creating beautiful portraits with flowers and birds and mountains and everything interesting, intricate, integrated into the poster design. All right. Art Deco is another very interesting design movement that came around that time where we were leaving that Victorian organic Art Nouveau style, getting into a more um, geometric, powerful modern style. But even this is more detailed than what you might see in the Bauhaus. I mean, look at that chandelier. Crazy detail. Um, Lots of interesting design shapes and materials shown in that Art Deco style. But again, this is too much for the Bauhaus. So when you get into that typography, you can see how the type design is not too different from the architecture. Ornamented, stylized. So compare that to what Bauhaus typography looks like, right? Simplified. Set up a grid, make those letters conform to the grid, and look for similarities and harmonies between the shapes. All the lines are the same thickness. All the shapes have the same angle, right? There are a few different types of type, say that three times fast, that came from the Bauhaus. One is Karl Marx, not that Karl Marx, but actually a man type designer at the Bauhaus who worked in that style, created this style. And where did you see it? Here's a few others. Super Mario Brothers. So even these type styles are out there around us and still used. And so that's my little share I wanted to give you about the Bauhaus, how it started out as kind of a rejection of those Victorian ideas, simplifying into a more modern design style where you could harmonize everything into that one thought process, but then also how that became the basis for a lot of modern graphic design and style that we see today, even today. So, hope you enjoyed that. See you later.